Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. Thanks very much the Czech Academy of Science and mainly Jiří for the invitation. It's, as I said, a big pleasure and a great honor for me to be here amongst you, amongst all the specialists. And I have to point out, first of all, that my point of view is quite different. Because I'm a folklorist. I'm mainly specialized on folklore and folk beliefs. So my point of view is going to be a little bit different. It's not archaeological. It's not that philological. It's mainly history and reception and perception of paganism, of pre-Christian Slavic religion. Mainly what interests me, and what interested me until here, is the idea of reconstruction of some deities. And when I'm talking about reconstruction, what interests me even more is a pseudo mythology. I mean, the fake mythology, the fake lore. So I'm going to talk about that. And if I can say that if I work on Slavic mythology, I mainly work on this domain. So I'm a little bit like a negative person here, like a black sheep. So I'm not going to explain to you what is a reconstruction. Everybody knows. And of course, most of you know that it's a particular method that has been primarily associated to the folkloristics of the 19th century, and mainly with the Grimm brothers, I mean, with the German mythological school, which influenced later the development of the study of mythology throughout Europe by creating offshoots. In the 19th century, an ancient European mythology actually had vanished. This is logical, and Christian writers were the main source of written records. Reconstructing mythology became necessary, and this prompted folklorists to undertake. So when we're talking about folklorists in the 19th century, it's not very specific. It's not like a science that is called. It's like you can be philologist, you can be archaeologist, you can be different things and define yourself as a folklorist. So it's not very defined yet in 19th century. And for some anthropologists, it's not even in 20th century and 21st century. It's a big problem of folklore, of folkloristics. So they undertook varying degrees of reconstruction. And the most well-known example is the Grimm's brothers, and mainly Jakob with his work Deutsche Mythologie, where he heavily relied on Icelandic saga material for reconstruction of German mythology. So the reconstruction of ancient civilization based on linguistic analysis, this you know it of course, or philology, and remained a significant approach for folkloric mythologists. And the most important approach for folklorists was the study and re-examination of folk customs and beliefs, with the aim of finding through assumptions an original, mainly pre-Christian form of the myth. However, it would be wrong to claim that the method of reconstruction suddenly appeared in the 19th century. Similar attempts where customs, beliefs, or linguistic elements were used to revive older forms of culture were often observed in previous centuries. In the Slavic field, Dlukos and the Polish chronographers in general were the first to repeatedly apply reconstruction in the field of Slavic mythology, even if it was done in a rudimentary way. And the tendency to create fictitious theonyms by the clergy and medieval chroniclers appears at the beginning of the treatment of Slavic myths, and more specifically of the Slavic pantheon. To achieve this goal, ancient and Roman mythology were used as models, structured from a multitude of sources that offered the potential researcher a relative safety. Therefore, through the method of interpretatio classica, Slavic paganism was understood and interpreted through the common themes of Greco-Roman antiquity. More specifically, the most influential representative of this trend, as I said, was the priest, chronicler, and diplomat Jan Dlukos, Polish, of course, attempted to attribute a Slavic deity to one or more from Greco-Roman antiquity. So the very important Polish-German specialist Bruckner questions Dlukos' sources by arguing that he formed his Polish pantheon by freely interpreting ancient ritual texts, especially ritual songs, refrains based on folk tradition. I'm giving an example. Glucos acted similarly with several seemingly fictional deities, such as the goddess of death and equivalent of Pluto, as he says, Nia, the goddess of marriage and equivalent of Venus, Gigilela, or the famous goddess of war equivalent to Mars, Lada. To form the names of Gigilela and Lada, the Polish chronographer relied on folk songs, which repeated in the refrain the words Gigi or Lada, in order to assume that behind these repetitions there were invocations of these specific deities. In this case, Lugos proceeds, of course, with an early form of reconstruction. The influence of Lugos in a climate of general desire to create mythology on the basis of the already existing Greco-Roman tradition was continued during the golden century of Poland, with important scholars like Stryszkowski, Mieszkowski, and Martin Kromer, and others. I just mentioned some names. They did exactly the same, and in many cases, they just copied Lugos. So according to Kromer, the Poles and other Slavic nations honored as gods in their own way Mars, Pluto, Ceres, Venera, Venus, and Diana. You see all these Greco-Roman deities, naming them Yesa, Lada, Orladon, Nia, Marzana, Zezulia, Zievona, respectively. Referring to Lugos, and this is extremely interesting, Kromer says that he witnessed the idolatrous practices. He was an eyewitness. So he considers that the Slavs retained for a long time through the old scourge of idolatry, worshipping gods such as Mars, Pluto, Ceres, Venus, that they named Lada, Ladon, etc., etc. Similar constructions of theonism among representatives of ancient Slavic literature and also can be found in other countries, like in Bohemia, for example, regions, like in Bohemia with Hayek and Stransky, Stredowski, and Papanek, and others. They do exactly the same thing, and they add new names. They copy Glucos in many cases, but they add new names like Krosopane, Merot, Radamas, Chladolet, etc. And this continues until quite late. And this, what interests us a lot, is that through Polish chronographers mainly, these names pass also to Russia, to the eastern part of Slavic region, with some chronicles like the Hustin Chronicle, and where we can see, actually, if we examine in depth, that some names they are transported there. So we have all this Russian early literature with chronicles, religious texts and stuff, and from there some influences to authors of 18th century like Tatishev and Lomonosov that they worked on mythology, and from there the folklorists of 19th century and 20th century. So let's go to the main part of the presentation. So, and the one that interests us more is that Reconstruction mythological theories continue to develop over the centuries, culminating in the 19th century, of course. The primary reason was the rise of general patriotism in Europe following the creation of nation states and the emergence of nationalist movements that sought to form a well-defined national identity. The study of mythology was a fundamental field of research for national identity, of course, meeting the needs of scholars who either identified it as a means to highlight the glorious past of ancestors, or when comparing this mythology to present beliefs as evidence of continuity. This idea of continuity is extremely important now between past and present. In the case of Slavic nations, the dominant cultural movement of Slavophilia, and Pan-Slavism looked back to a vaguely remembered moment of unity before the dispersal of Slavic tribes, hoping to see the ancient unity return. If such a historical moment were to be found, it could be it was clearly before the various forms of Christianity were adopted by Slavic nations. Consequently, part of the intelligentsia, of the Russian intelligentsia, not only I examine Russian intelligentsia, but several similar things happen in other Slavic countries. So a part of the Russian intelligentsia turned to ancient religion and mythology, which was not easy due to the lack of sources. This is extremely important, that we don't have written sources. We have archaeological sources, more archaeological sources, but written sources we have very few. Faced with this absence of national mythology, representatives of the newly established folkloric field turned, of course, to the study of popular culture. They considered that recent beliefs and customs contained remnants of antiquity and thus the desired continuity. In Russia, national motivations were already evident in the pre-scientific phase of folkloristics, particularly in 30s and 40s, where a significant part of the Russian intelligentsia supported ideas endorsed by the government, promoting the principles of orthodoxy and mainly autocracy and nationality. These ideas influenced Snegiryov, Sakharov, and Tereshenko, that they were the main folklorists of the early phase of folklore in Russia, and shaped their approach to material through positions that later contested by more rigorous folklorists. They considered that these three, Snegiryov, Sakharov, and Tereshenko, had reworked and modified authentic folkloric material to support all these ideas inspired by nationalism, and of course promoted by Tsarist government. So similarly, Kostomarov, that was a poet, ethnographer, a pan-Slavist, and promoter of the so-called Narodniki movement in the Russian Empire, as well as a key figure in the Ukrainian national revival movement, was one of the first to attempt to identify the spirit of the people through ethnographic studies, mainly songs, including the so-called national spirit. And an example of falsified theory of Kostomarov is the goddess Dana, whom he claimed to be the goddess of water, patron of rivers, streams, and reservoirs in Slavic mythology. And Kostomarov argued that her existence among the Eastern Slavs could be confirmed by the names of rivers like Dvina, Danube, Don, and Dnieper, and the refrain of ritual songs repeating the word Dana. Such assertions, of course, they were arbitrary and lacked systematic argumentation, yet were common in the pre-scientific phase of folkloristics. And during the same period, German folkloristic theories, specifically from the mythological school, were established in Russia, built mainly on Grimm's works, as I said, and echoing national intent of German folkloristics, like philosophical ideas of Herder, Geres, Fichte, and stuff. The German mythological school saw popular folk literature and especially fairy tales as the last vestiges of Aryan mythology. So in Germany, they sought to reconstruct Indo-European myths quite often to prove German superiority, even if these required hasty arguments. And regarding the Russian school, it was not a mere transfer, and this is quite important. It was not a mere transfer of ideas and theories from the mythological school, but an adaptation to the imperatives of Russian Slavic reality. The Russian mythological school was influenced by the general spirit of the time, largely determined by the conflict between the Slavophiles and the Westerners, and emerged from the development of the humanities in 1840s, which often drew the material from popular culture that needed systematic study. The main representatives of the Russian mythological school were Buslaev and one that you all know, Afanasiev. Maybe Afanasiev is mainly known for his fairy tales, but in reality, in Russia, they consider it even more important for a book that he wrote it's called The Poetic Outlook on Nature by Slavs, which was considered very, very important. For example, the famous composer Rimsky-Korsakov called it the pantheistic Bible of the Slavonic peoples. So in reality, today, for some folklorists, it still remains a Bible. For some others, it is a reconstruction of ancient mythology. Actually, they believe that Afanasiev did not much reconstruct ancient mythology, just completed its construction, interrupted by the introduction of Christianity. So he really falsified and created and fabricated a new mythology. So the book, A Poetic Outlook on Nature, by the Slavs, was published in 3 volumes between 1865 and 1869, and really carefully studies the practices, beliefs, and myths of the Slavs. And the main concern of the author, of course, it was to connect the above with the pre-Christian culture and religion. So he looked for surviving elements in the newer culture, considering, for example, Slavic folk holidays to be remnants of the religion of sun worship, a very important theory that came also from Germany, from Miller. And through these survivals, he tried to reconstruct the mythology and religion of the ancient Slavs. In order to reconstruct ancient mythology, he really insisted on linguistics, comparative linguistics, which have already been successfully applied to the study of Indo-European languages and the reconstruction of the culture of their speakers. The author indicates sources for the reconstruction of the mythological ideas of the Slavs. These are the dialect vocabulary, folklore texts, first of all, riddles, proverbs, sayings, jokes, and then oaths, omens, and interpretation of dreams and medical instruction. And for him, mainly the most important source is spells. And to a lesser extent, ritual songs. However, the uncritical use of folkloric data produced several phantom gods, and this is what interests me most. So in the process of reconstructing ancient mythology, gods with scant historical sources like Horse and Simargl acquired a rich mythology based on often extreme hypotheses. An example is Mokosha, considered the goddess of the earth mother based on the analysis of her name, probably deriving from the Slavic root mok, wet, moist. In many cases, it was also assumed with substantial evidence that a Christian saint was nothing more than an evolution of a pagan god, viewing popular Christianity as an emanation of ancient paganism. These rather risky hypotheses, through more systematic than those of pre-scientific folklorists, were generally presented in an amateurish manner, without bibliography and references, of course. And they attempted to restore the original myth through etymology, often a false etymology, and the often distorted analysis of a custom or a belief, supposedly informing us about the original form of the myth. Following this exact logic, folklorists used popular demonology, and this is a point that I find quite interesting. So they used popular demonology in so-called lower mythology to reshape the higher mythology. I don't have the time to explain. I guess you all know the difference. Lower mythology is all these demons, fairies and vampires and stuff, where higher mythology is all the big gods, Perun, Veles and stuff. So, however, using lower mythology as a basis for conclusions about higher mythology is not a very secure method, as the transition from one domain to the other is not assured, since higher and lower mythology coexist, but they are not at all identical. The amateur ethnomusicologist and folklorist Famichin did the same in his book, Divinities of the Ancient Slavs, which is full of exaggerated and unscientific hypotheses. Here, for example, the god Simargl is considered as a corrupted notation, originally meant to read Sim Yaril, the reconstructed god of vegetation and fertility. Already Yaril is a god that is quite probably reconstructed. And elsewhere, he claims that in Belarus, a limited memory of the already precarious god Beloboch, that for some specialists is also a reconstruction of the 17th century, based on Chernobog, that exists in reality in sources, preserved in the figure of Belun, a good spirit guiding those lost in the forest back to the road. This association is not original, but borrowed either from Afanasiev, who compared Belun to Beloboch, or from the Belarusian writer ethnographer Pavel Spilevsky Drevlyansky's Belarusian folklore legends. This case is quite interesting, as Drevlyansky described the image of Yarila as a man on a white horse, among others. I mean, his book is quite big, and he has many extravagant theories. One of them is that Yarila is a man on a white horse, or if it is a girl, a white robe. And if Yarila was portrayed by a guy, he was often naked, and Yarila's head is covered with a wreath of spring flowers in his hands and arrears of corns, and himself is young, light-eyed and with light curly hair. Now we start having an iconography, but according to the terms of 19th century. So we go a little bit back to what Jerzy was saying yesterday, but now the terms are quite different. So it's 19th century semiotics that enters in the game. So he's young, light-eyed, and curly hair and stuff. Of course, we have no references and sources that they describe Yarilo like that. And what is even more important is that where Yarilo goes, there will be a good harvest, and whoever he looks at, love will flare up in his heart. In many songs and sayings, people turn to his deity asking for a warm summer and a good harvest. Yarilo participates in Belarusian holidays in the form of Yara Yarilicha. Of course, we don't have the text. He doesn't give the text about all these gods. So Drevliansky is now very famous, even in Russian bibliography, for his dubious works in the field of Slavic folklore and mythology studies. His theory is born in the climate of Russification in the 40s, when Belarus was seeking its national identity, mainly expressed the idea that Belarusians are the oldest among Slavs, traceable through mythology. However, most of the mythical characters described by Drevliansky are recognized as fantasies that never existed in Slavic folklore, and are the product of the author's work, who used popular demonology to create a pagan pantheon. This was highlighted by Potebnia already in 65. He wrote an article that's called On the Mythical Significance of Certain Rites and Beliefs, noting that Drevliansky mixed his fantasies with folkloric beliefs. And more recently, Levkievskaya, a very good specialist, argued that this work stems from the childish, I find it quite interesting, this reference, stems from the childish need for national affirmation, the desire to prove to ourselves that we are not worse than others. Similar fantasies persisted in the 20th century in a significantly different ideological context, notably in the Soviet Union. Stalin took a keen interest in research on Slavic antiquity, hoping that such studies would help the Soviet regime demonstrate the primitive communism of the Russians. In this case, mythology and paganism were used for Marxist atheist ideological purposes against oppressive Christianity, aiming to prove that the people were never truly Christian and Christianized, but remained vaguely faithful to paganism. One of the main proponents of these ideas was the former director of the Institute of Archaeology, Boris Rybakov. You all know him, died in 2001, that is still considered a major authority on Russian folklore and mythology, and who provided, and this is quite interesting, the first academic arguments for neo-paganism. Neo-paganists use him a lot. To promote a view of pre-Christian religion favoring a communal society and denouncing Christianity for justifying class divisions, he often pushed efforts to reconstruct mythology to extremes. The unreliable method of reconstruction to form a complete mythology continued during the political less harsh periods of the Soviet Union, and thus in the 70s, with some linguists, mainly Ivanov, Toporov, and Gantreglidze, that contributed to the revival of the debate on the proto-homeland of the Indo-Europeans, which their Soviet colleagues located between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Scholars of the so-called semiotic school, Ivanov and Toporov, that we use them still a lot, attempted to reconstruct Slavic mythology using comparative Indo-European materials. To do so, they uncritically accepted the conclusions of the mythological school of the 19th century in the interpretation of the nature of Slavic gods, making their theories precarious hypotheses. Here, I have to point out that Ivanov and Toporov considered Drevliansky's assumptions authentic. Drevliansky's, we all know that he was just writing fantasies. So they included some of the Drevliansky's assumptions in the theories. So in this case, the reconstruction was done to satisfy the Indo-European Aryan theory, according to Ivanov Toporov, in the, how many minutes? Something like, not at all, okay, I will finish. And the South Slavic version of the serpent wrestling myth, the sun, the solar gods and stuff. So Ivanov Toporov, they use it a lot. And I just to say before the conclusion that after the Second World War, that these theories, a lot of these theories that with many aspects that they are unfounded, were used and expanded, and to a large extent, this is understandable by the general public, and a characteristic field in which Reconstruction took on outrageous proportion is that of Slavic neo-paganism, that they are called Reconstructionists quite often. So after the Second World War, there is a journal that's called Zhar Ptitsa. Already the name revokes all these nationalist Russian ideas, that is published in San Francisco, that promoted the neo-pagan book of Veles as an ancient manuscript on pre-Christian Slavic faith. The transcription incorporated a mix of several modern Slavic languages, supposedly representing a proto-Slavic language. The book opens with a hymn to the Pomeranian three-faced god, the Triglav, references a wide range of Indian and Slavic gods, many of whom never existed. Such an example is Chislo Bog, a deity of time and of numbers, identical to the Roman god Saturn, about whom we have, of course, no information in early sources. Despite scholarly consensus of its forgery, Russian and Ukrainian neo-pagans and nationalists regarded as a sacred book. Efforts to authenticate it continue, including the 2015 expertise on the Book of Veles and the Slavic Aryan Veda. There are books that they try to prove that the Book of Veles is true. And in order to conclude, as we said, the folkloric analysis is also contributed to the understanding of Slavic mythology. I'm not saying the opposite, with scholars like Afanasiev using linguistic and cultural data to reconstruct ancient myths. However, this method often led to speculative hypotheses and the creation of phantom gods, highlighting the challenges of interpreting folklore with a mythological text. Of course, in this case, we had the help of all these nationalistic ideas and political agendas, the creation of all these fictional gods is quite extended. Such an example is Kupala and Kolyada, that you've already heard, of course, that have today been established as a key parts of Slavic mythology, and having even acquired the relevant iconography. And in an article that I published last year, I proposed that these two gods were not even part of pre-Christian Slavic worship. We can find them as creations in Polish chronicles, and then they pass in Russian chronicles, and then they arrive to Russian folklorists that they really inflate these theories about Kolyada and Kupala. So the information that the old text provides is minimal. On the contrary, due to completely misleading effect of Reconstruction, we have a huge mythology about these two gods. Other names is Morzana and Morana Morzana, ancient goddess of death identified with the death goddess Persephone or Proserpine, that folklorists based this recreation on a sacrificial rite where a straw effigy named Morana plays a central role in a funeral procession before being sacrificed to ensure a god harvest the following year. In conclusion, quite often we have a core of early texts, and from there it follows a life similar to that of fake news, that is, new articles that are intentionally and verifiably false and could mislead readers. Just like fake news, these fabricated myths follow an incremental process that was influenced by external factors, either the initial need to fill the gap in the study of knowledge about Slavic mythology through the matching with the Greco-Roman gods, or later the creation of an entire and nationally independent Slavic Russian, in this case, mythology, or finally, the creation of a national religious neo-pagan religion, Bible and religion. It is not always easy to accept that, like fake news, false myths are intentionally and verifiably false, but they certainly propagate and inflate in a similar way before eventually becoming established and taken for granted. For that reason, we sometimes need to question and rigorously scrutinize the conclusions of Reconstruction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stamatis, for this fascinating paper pointing out many important subjects. And thank you, honestly, for throwing some of our toys into a ditch, as the saying in Czech goes, because and I mean it, because if your toys are thrown into a ditch, it makes you think, do I really want them back once I retrieve them, or are they worth it? So it's really an opportunity to think about all those modern influences in scholarly discourse on history, of course. So questions, please.
So also, thank you very much for this thoughtful presentation. I think it's very important. It interests me from a philosophical perspective because this really touches on a very deep conceptual issues. So my commentary is, I don't know if you mention it or consider this point of view that many times the forgeries or the fabrications follow the pattern of, in the minds of the forgers, of elevation of the Slavic paganism, when they put the names of Roman or Greek gods, they want to elevate what they perceive maybe subconsciously or consciously as an inferior tradition. Or you mentioned at the end the creation of a neo-pagan Bible, for example. This is an adaptation to a different model of religion. So basically, it's an alienation of what is the real Slavic tradition by attempting to elevate it. So I don't know if you followed also, which doesn't mean it's completely, it's a toy to be ditched, to be put in a ditch, which is completely inexistent or something, but that there's a tendency to make it into something else because it's perceived as more civilized, whereas the real Slavic tradition is maybe not comprehended, maybe at the end.
I absolutely agree, and this is my point as well. This was my point. I mean that in reality, the research of and the knowledge of Slavic mythology starts like that. I mean, starts with Polish chronographers that they work on, that they mention, mainly Dulukos, that they mention some names, always doing the correspondence with the Greek Roman deities. And this, it goes on and it goes on. I mean, Jirzi, we were discussing about this subject some days ago, and he showed to me an absolutely amazing table that he prepared. And I mean, there you can see a lot of these correspondences between Slavic gods and ancient Greek gods. I mean, the basis is ancient Greek gods because absolutely they try to imitate and to say that, okay, yes, we have an amazing mythology, that's the ancient Greek mythology with a lot of sources and stuff, and we will have to propose something similar. So at the beginning, chronographers, they are doing that by creating some names or finding some names in folklore or I don't know where, in order to say that we have the same gods here as well. And later they start using a lot because in 19th century we have finally we register all these folk songs, fairy tales and stuff. So we have sources. Considering like these sources, the remnants of this Slavic mythology. So in these cases, we passed mainly to that. There we see it a little bit less. We don't have these correspondences with ancient Greek mythology. We almost never have this in 19th century. 18th century, for example, in Russia, we have it Lomonosov and Tatishev, for example, that they use all these chronicles and stuff. They are still in this idea, but they don't, Lomonosov and Tatishev, I mean, in the 18th century, they don't use a lot folklore. Folklore is mainly 19th century, and when we have folklore, we have much less this correspondence with ancient Greek mythology. Because in this case, we consider that we have a mythology and we can see it everywhere all around us in folk traditions. So in this case, the perception changes a lot and the semiotics change a lot, I think.
Thank you for this critical view. It was very interesting, nice. But I have a question. Actually, you spoke about abuse, let's say, of this pagan mythology in some new ideology, let's say also in 20th century and so on, as a country point to the Christianity, for example, and so on. But there are also some tradition, folk tradition, which were not very welcome. Ne? For example, this Pятница, ne? It should be some analogy to Mokosh and so on. And what if I'm not wrong, ne? That the women in the Soviet Union, let's say, were still believed in this Pятница and didn't want to work on Friday, ne? And it was the problem, ne? of so this government and so on, and they try to push this tradition.
Yes.
Yeah. So there are some independent, real folk tradition which were perhaps really connected to this folk beliefs and so on, and they are not in line, with this ideology.
Yes, to tell you the truth, I'm not really with this side of the bibliography, that the literature that see this connection between saints and pre-Christian gods so evidently. For example, this Pятница, we have exactly the same traditions in Greece, where there is nothing Slavic. I mean, you cannot work on Friday. I mean, because this San Friday, San Paraskevi will come. I mean, exactly the same. So, for example, to say that, yes, in Russia, this Pятница means that there's Mokosa behind and you should respect your day, and that we can see it in folklore, is quite precarious, because we can see exactly the same in Greece, that there was never Slavic, I don't know, folk religion. There were other things. So, of course, we can see remnants. But in my opinion, it was very, very fancy and very interesting to see remnants everywhere since 19th century. And I think we have to get into a more, to reconsider a little bit more where these remnants exist. Because the idea of to see everywhere remnants, it was very nice, very fancy, mainly in the 19th century for national reasons as well, ideological reasons, not only national, but other reasons as well. Now it's a little bit less fancy, and we have to get into, I think, the idea to see a little bit that Christianity played an extremely important role also in the formation of folk beliefs. It was not only paganism that formed the folk beliefs.
Okay, some other questions or remarks? Okay.
It was not that important. I mean, okay, very, very interesting debate. Even a book was written in 30s, like the Greek folklorists, they started like that as an answer to a specialist that's called Van Merayer. He was Austrian-German, okay, the period we couldn't talk about German or Austrian, he was from Tirolo. And he exactly supported that Greeks are Slavs. So in this case, we had a lot of Greek folklorists trying to prove that no, they were not Slavs and stuff. So of course there were these Slav tribes, quite important settlement in the 7th, 8th century, even maybe before. But I guess what you can see more, it's other things than Slav in folklore. And I would say the opposite, actually, that in Russia, for example, the Byzantine folklore is extremely evident, actually. Even a great specialist that is called Nikita Tolstoy, ethnolinguist, he pointed out that, I mean, you can find very much these Byzantine influences in folklore of Russia.
Sorry, if I could, I would have one question. Perhaps it doesn't relate very much to what you were talking about, but I think the problem of or reason of reinvention of pagan Slavic paganity is that unlike Scandinavia, there are not mythology which is not preserved. Yeah,
exactly.
So we in Cosmas or Gal Anonym and so on, they didn't mention any original Slavic gods. They replaced them with the Latin or Greek ones. And what do you mean? What's the reason for that? That unlike Scandinavia, there was a completely different approach to the pagan tradition, oral tradition.
This is extremely interesting and important to check it, because I didn't really know the reason. Indeed, we don't have written sources I mean, we have almost 15 sources that they talk about gods, And these sources, they are not even quite analytic. I mean, they just mention the name. In most of the cases, some others, they mention a little bit more, but we don't really have extended sources until, I don't know, 15th century. In 15th century, you start having a little bit more, but in this case, in 15th, 16th century, it's very late in order to be based on these sources. So for sure, archaeological sources are the more important, but the thing is that the archaeological sources, they speak in a different way than written sources, in an absolutely different way. So it's not the same way that, I mean, if we take, for example, the Greek mythology we have an enormous amount of sources where you can see what is Jewish. You can see what is, I mean, even lower date is like Lamia or I don't know. So in Slavic region, you cannot do that. I mean, it's absolutely different, and I don't know the reason. I mean, I guess there is a reason for which we don't have written sources.
Okay, just.
Well, some things, some thoughts on this theme. Why we do have so rare written sources? Because the tradition of the Old Faith didn't come in the higher cultural layers. That's one of them, and the second one is the the relation between the Christianity and the Old Faith. This was a kind of a war, public relations war, informative war, and there was a huge amount of ignorance. They do not want to mention these creatures. They do not want to speak about them. They thought that if they do so, then there will be everything away. It will disappear. And I can make a parallel. I showed you yesterday these tombstones of the souls from the region of Velebit in Croatia. They are the so-called Mirila. And they are in thousands there. From the northern Dalmatia to the south Dalmatia, almost to the Montenegro. So in hundreds of villages, but there is no one written source about it. And for instance, there is a village where was a priest, Christian priest, who wrote a very exactly ethnographical description of this village. This village has such Mirila, but there was no word of Mirila in his description, because these Mirila are some kind, let's say, a compromise between the Old Faith and between the Christianity. So because it was left to the people that they may do with the souls what they want. It was only important to bring the bodies of the deceased to the church graveyard, but the souls remained in their power, and they do with them what they want. But there was no word. There was a colleague in Split. She went to the Archbishop Archive to find some written sources. No word, no word.
And just I would like to add something that I find extremely interesting. I didn't talk at all about that. I talked about only the reconstruction, where there is a basis, there is an objectively a basis, because then there is another big amount of texts that they're absolutely falsified. They're falsifications. I mean, they are fake texts that they propose themselves like folk songs, like Veda Slovenia in Bulgaria. That is an extremely interesting example. And for a long period, even today, there are people that they consider it like a true source. The compiler, what he did is in the 19th century, he said that he found folk songs in Bulgaria that they prove the continuation with all these ancient gods and goddesses. So he presented them like that. But it is easily proved that it is a falsification. And even until today, or Mater Verborum, Mater Verborum, there's in a big part of Mater Verborum is a falsification. So it's intensively falsified in order to add some. And what's the name of this archaeological falsification in? Yes.
Prelit.
Exactly. That is also that for a long period also they were considered like true sources, and this makes things even more complicated. So to take some books of Slavic mythology today, I mean, to read about, as I started, I mean, I bought some books in Russian and stuff to read about Slavic mythology, and there I could find a huge amount of information about Veles, Perun, and then Mokosa, Yarilo, and stuff, and finally it was proved that there are no written sources. I mean, even for the big gods, like the important gods like Perun and Veles, things are quite, yes, of course, we have more information and mainly archaeological testimonies, but even there, it's quite fragile, I think, the situation.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And